All right, welcome everyone. We are with Chris Gibbs and Eduardo Molina, and they are going to talk today about deploying Unicon in healthcare, lessons learned from the field. Feel free to use the chat and ask questions, and then we can either do those during or at the end. How do you guys want to handle questions?
Um, Somehow, Jaren, I do not see the interface as just for Zoom, so we can do it either way. If you
Okay.
can read them, will be fantastic.
Yep, I'll read them. So do you want me to ask they come in or at the
Yeah,
end?
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
As they come in.
Well, I'll go ahead and hand over to you guys. So here we go.
Hey, awesome. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending where you are in the world. My name is Eduardo Molina, and I am the general manager for the digital and data center practice here at Cortec. And with me, we have Chris Gibbs. Chris, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yes. Hello, everybody. Chris Gibbs. I'm here at Cortec now for the last 4 years. I've been in EUC environment for the last, ooh, 24 years or so, 28 years in IT in general. So glad to be here with you today.
Awesome. And I don't know how many of you are familiar or not with Unicon, right? A acquisition that Citrix made a couple years ago almost. So if you are familiar or not, I would love to read you on the chat. I now found how to do that on the chat, so I have the chat open. But moving right along, we don't have a lot of slides, so hopefully we make this very interactive. We're gonna review the architecture of Unicon. What is Unicon to begin with? Then we're gonna go into the lessons that from the field, right? What did we learn about the system requirements? What did we learn about Scott and Elias? And we will talk about that a lot more. What we will learn about Elux, the Improvada integration is going to be very important, and the documentation. I want to start by stressing that this is based on a few projects that we have done, a few clients that were very interested on adopting Unicon, whether it's to be new to this type of operating system because now they're entitled to it, whether they're trying to consider removing other technologies. Those all things were things that we were looking into. Um, from a Unicon at a glance, right? As I mentioned, it was a solution that Citrix acquired a couple years ago from a company called Unicon. They kept the name, and they have a whole group of people inside and product managers working on these solutions. Um, it is an operating system, right? That's the Scout part. Sorry, that's the Elux part. The operating system is named Elux. The management console is called Scout. And then there is a third part that is part in the architecture that we'll see below, which is Elias. It can run on existing thin clients. It can run on laptops that are transformed. It can run on any PC, on any all-in-one. It can even be born into a born, quote unquote, born. I guess I'm all on sharing where I used to born CDs and DVDs. It can be imaged on a USB and then just plug it in, boot from USB, and you have Unicon slash Elux running. And then the hardware, they have a vast majority of the hardware vendors out there that are part of the HCL. One thing that has been really good for us, as we have done some Unicon projects, is that we work with the team and we tell them, hey, this is a Dell, blah, 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 or this is an HP, blah, 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 blah. Will it work? And then it goes down more to the individual, NIC model or the individual, amount of RAM or CPU, and motherboard and BIOS more than the specific model, right? So that they validate that, and then with our help, they add more. Or with your help, they will add more devices into that
Hardware
HCL,
compatible.
into that HCL. Um, Unicon, as a company, supported and supports still multiple protocols, right? You can do RDP, you can do HDX, you can do Omnisa, and those things are going to start contracting into an HDX only approach as Citrix starts to integrate more and more and more of the Unicon ecosystem into Citrix.
Hey, quick question. So, what is the hardware requirements and basic specs to run Unicon?
We will touch on that on the systems requirements. Is that okay? Yeah, that's a fantastic question. But high level, right, has to be an x86 type of operating system with, 4 to 8 gigs. I think we recommend 8 gigs of RAM to run. Now, and the reason why I'm switching this is what I want to make sure that we highlight here is ELOX, right? Unicon is the name of the solution, right? We have tend to call Unicon the operating system that runs on the endpoint internally, or when you're talking to people installing and deploying things, that's ELOX. ELOX is the OS. That's the OS. Scout, as you can see here, Scout is the management console that you use to manage ELOX. If you are required to manage devices that are outside of your network, then there is Scout Cloud Gateway, right? That's what creates the interface between the outside world and your internal network. Very, very likely you're going to put Scout on your DMZ. And there is another component that is Elias. Elias is the image management part of ELOX and Scout. So as other organizations have done, what Unicon as a company and Citrix now have done is when you going to deploy ELOX, you have multiple options to deploy, right? They have one image that has everything installed, right? It's a very large images that has all the individual packages that they have, hundreds of them. Or you can have a very, very small ELOX operating system, and then you add the components that you need. You add a browser, you add the Improvata agent, you add the HDX agent, and all those things are added. You might add a DEX component to it so you can send information into Splunk, or you can send information into Control App, for example. That orchestration, that tool that creates that image and maintains that image, it's called Elias. As of right now, those are two separate servers or two separate functions. Citrix is working very, very diligently into moving Elias inside of Scout. Furthermore, Citrix is working very fast into making this whole solution part of the DAS platform and be consumable as just part of your Citrix DAS. So no longer you will need to have a Windows server. Again, we're going to go into the system requirements. Windows server run, on premises running your Scout component and your Alliance component. There is obviously going to be a very intrinsic need to an identity management solution, right? Active Directory, for example. And there is interaction between all the endpoints and Elias and the Scout. Chris, anything you want to add on this?
Pretty much, one of the things that you want to take into consideration is the number of endpoints that you're going to be managing. That will dictate more what the sizing requirements of the servers will be. And the cloud gateway component of that also, a little bit behind the scenes, is that each cloud gateway appliance can support about 1,000 endpoints. So if you have devices that are coming in from the internet and you want to be able to manage them, there's a little micro VPN that is running, and that is what's used. And so that's the limitation that they currently have on a per appliance basis. They are working towards re-engineering that using some existing services that Citrix has in cloud to be able to scale that better.
Perfect. So I see I see the question out there from you, Norman, about health checks. So Scout will be that management tool where you see the user devices, where you will use to create the policies, the configuration, to push out patches that are delivered through Elias for now. Not sure what you mean by current issues or bugs or health checks, right? At the end, if you're talking about, hey, am I running out of CPU or RAM on that endpoint? If you're talking about then a lot of that information is going to be viewable through Director. Um, but
Yeah.
bugs meaning like, hey, somebody reported an issue because they couldn't log in this morning. That wouldn't be on a Scout, right? That would not be on a Scout. Current issues will not be on a Scout. I don't think there's a tool that you can report tools. You will use your ITIL tool, right, for incident management to maintain issues or bugs track of. Not that wouldn't be done in a Scout or Elias at all. So what we have learned, and Chris, let's you take the next few slides, and I just hit next.
Okay. Yeah, one of the key things, and this isn't necessarily just unique to the healthcare industry, so I'm just calling a couple of these items out just in general, is license entitlement. And what this kind of is related to more or less is that when you actually have renewed, or if a customer of yours has renewed, and depending on when that time fell in with the acquisition, we have ran into a couple of issues where the license wasn't truly activated and the entitlements were not available. So a little bit of due diligence on your part to make sure that you go out and research that and make sure that the entitlement is actually there. And now with everybody being switched over to LAS, wink, wink, you should be able to see your entitlement inside your Citrix license server. If you're on-prem, you would have that ability to see that as a separate line item in there. But make sure that you get that taken care of ahead of time before starting your project, because it can take a couple of weeks to resolve that. Making sure that you get your database service account set up, because Scout will need a database. Elias uses a database as well, and as you can see in the next bullet item there is about the MongoDB. That's what Elias is using currently. And so if a customer does have, or you do have a MongoDB, there are specific requirements for that. Make sure that you meet those, and you could use your existing MongoDB instance. And that could be preferable just in the form of making sure that it's staying patched in a timely fashion. You're in more control instead of waiting for Citrix to go through and do the update to their release and then get the patch for Mongo pushed in and pushed through there. So it may behoove you to do it that way. Um,
One more
another,
thing to add in terms of databases, Chris, the database for Scout is SQL Server. The database for Elias is MongoDB. So
correct.
that's part of the interesting part. What depending on the size of the environment, you might want to run it in two separate servers because the size of the databases might be impacting the performance of both technologies. That's one of the things that I think every partner has provided input is this needs to be simplified into a single database, whether it's MongoDB for everything or SQL Server for everything. But think about, for Scout, you need SQL, which is a separate installation. For Elias, it will deploy it. If you don't have one, it will deploy MongoDB for you.
Yep, and along the same lines as far as what the Mongo is used for, it's not just like a configuration. So the packages for Elux are actually imported into the MongoDB. And so when you're going through the interface of Elias, what you're doing is you're selecting, it's almost like a recipe. You say, okay, I want to have the Citrix Workspace app for Linux. I want to have Pulse Audio, Imprivata in the healthcare industry. So you add in these different packages, and those packages are referenced and pulled out of the MongoDB. So that's where it's actually storing that information inside of there.
Yeah.
Um,
So to answer Norman's question on, so for the endpoint, right? What I mentioned, for from the endpoint, the requirement is 4 gigs of RAM at a minimum. It has to be an 886. It doesn't matter if it's Intel or AMD, but it has to be an 886 workstation. And very importantly, it has to be capable of booting up on UEFI, right?
yes.
So if your endpoint is so old that doesn't even support UEFI, then that's too old of an endpoint. But anything I would say in the last 10 years or newer has at least 4 gigs of RAM and UEFI supported, which will open it for a lot of um, endpoints
Devices.
to be
Yeah.
to be devices. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, because that UEFI requirement there is the same as what people are familiar with from an iGel perspective as well. It's just a basic requirement that it supports that. So, and you would have to, going up to iGel OS 11 or from 11 to 12, you have to, do the flip if you had the legacy BIOS enabled. So, um, a key learning point is that you are unable to control the installation path for the MongoDB, so it will put it on the C drive. There's no ability to change that. And then another issue that we uncovered was if you go through an upgrade process of Elias, it doesn't recognize if you installed it to an alternate drive. Typically, I don't install anything other than the operating system, control agents, antivirus, XDR, stuff like that on the OS drive, and everything else goes to alternate drives. And so unfortunately, we found that out. And what it does is it reverts it back essentially to almost like a new install. So anything that you would install to the alternate drive is just ignored and it's put onto the C drive anyways. So just they have a fix out. I have to still test it out to see if this is truly resolved now. It was supposed to be resolved in 2603, which was just released last week on the 22nd of April.
So with that, right, our recommendations for whether you're using a Scout or Eli's or the Scout Cloud Gateway, the size of Eli's, it's gonna depend a lot on how many master images and packages you're gonna have, right? And also right now that C drive tend to be, on the bigger side. So don't try to create a smaller. Hey, I'm gonna go skinny and put a 40 gig C drive for my Elias server. Maybe think on the bigger side, right? 100 gig plus to be okay. You can always expand the C drive, but maybe better to have it from the get go. 8 gigs of RAM, 4 vCPUs at a minimum will be our recommendation from the management side, whether it's Elias, a Scout, or a Scout Cloud. So 8 gigs of RAM, right? If you're gonna do something very, very small and you want all three separate environments, so think about three separate servers, 8 gigs of RAM per server, 4 vCPUs, and 100 gigs or so of hard drive space per individual component of the architecture.
Yep. Yeah, don't skip on RAM. Never do that.
Never do that. Yeah. So moving right along to Elias and Scott, I think you started talking about this.
Yep. So a couple of things that we've learned along the way, and these are, items that we've kind of like been more accustomed to, and that is changes and configuration alterations that are done to an endpoint along the way and not requiring a reboot. So that's one of the unfortunate side effects that moving to ELX has, and that is that these are not as dynamic as other control systems are and other operating systems. And so we've had a discussion with Citrix. They're well aware of it, and they have embarked on trying to figure out which components at what pace they can do it to make a change to make it more dynamic and to be able to push it, especially in healthcare. We don't necessarily have a lot of times where there's, big maintenance windows and the freedom to be able to, reboot mass devices and make changes that have to require, a reboot. So we want to make sure that we can push that stuff out in the healthcare industry since they operate 24/7. From a design perspective, Scout follows in kind of an organizational unit methodology, kind of like your Active Directory does. Um, Recommendation just from a management perspective, don't go crazy on your OUs. Try to control as much as you can from a top level in your hierarchy. Obviously, when you're going through and you've got a test environment or a dev environment, you can make a change to that OU to where you don't inherit anything else from the parent, and that's where you can make all your changes and prove that out before you put in a change to do something for production. So it's just a lot easier to manage if you have, a more flat environment, and only make the necessary OUs to accommodate like a test or a dev environment. Um, Also, make sure that when you're going into this, have a full understanding of the features and functionality. Eduardo kind of touched on this. There's Elias that has all these different packages, and I alluded to a couple of them, like with Imprivata and having, Fluendo and GStreamer and making sure that all of the features, so you'll drag in, let's take for instance, the Citrix Workspace app for Linux, you'll drag that package in, but then there's a bunch of sub features. And some of those are like Microsoft Teams optimization, very important. Camera blur. So all these items really get a firm understanding of what you need to deliver, what the functionality needs to provide at the ELEX, and make sure that you go through and fully vet all that out and understand what it is. In those packages, as you drag more in, the image size is going to grow. And a little bit on what Eduardo touched on was, making sure that it's going to be able to handle, distribute that out. There's a dynamic proxy functionality that allows you to control, like if you had a branch office or a different facility that has like limited bandwidth and you have 100 items over there, 100 endpoints, you could set it up so that way either they all dynamically will be able to provide any kind of binary updates for those packages, or you can designate an FTP or an HTTP server that's there at that location, and you can point each location to that. So that way they're not coming across the WAN and hitting the Elias server and then struggling to get the updates pushed out in a timely fashion. So again, just make sure that you have that. And some of the other items are like if you're dealing with speech mics, which are pretty prevalent in the healthcare industry, as well as the SANE package. That's another one of those key pieces to have on the ELEX, and that is for scanners, document scanners in particular. And then just one kind of a side note, Citrix is making a strong push to get rid of its legacy Scout console and move to its web, what they call Scout board. So don't get too wrapped up in becoming too familiar with Scout console because it's going away.
Real quick, 7 minutes left, and then there was a question about encryption of storage drives of endpoint are managed in keys centrally stored on Scout or Elias. And
Perfect.
then
Yep.
Go ahead.
Yep, I have that. So the enablement of drive encryption happens at a Scout. It does require the endpoints to have a TPM version 2 chipset to get it encryption, and the keys are stored in Scout. But it does have a requirement TPM.
And then the other comment was tags were introduced recently, address the OU inheritance challenge. Was the comment.
Yep. Correct. We only have about 20 more slides, so we have plenty of time, Jerry.
Okay, so for ELEX, especially in the healthcare industry, you're going to want to stay on the current release track. There is an LTSR. The 2603 is the new version of LTSR, but you're going to want to stay on the current release track just because that's where all the development is going, and they're focused really hard on the healthcare environment support. So you're going to want to stay there. That's typically is about an every other month release cycle. So you're going to have to really pay attention to the release notes as to any of the functionality that's coming out and being released on those given versions. and or the bugs that are being resolved to see if that's something that you need to roll out, but you're going to have to be prepared to go through those at a pretty regular basis. One of the things that we had actually witnessed and brought to Citrix's attention was during an upgrade from 2510 to 2511, the login benchmark timings had suffered a little. And one of the key pieces that we want to kind of drive home is when you initially put it out there and you're starting to test, make sure that you establish, just like with EUC in general, in server-based computing, we always say, establish your benchmarks. Make sure that you get those out there and then do sufficient testing as you go for each version, doing the upgrades to make sure that you're not all of a sudden introducing some, slowness, because the nursing and the clinical staff are really going to be on you about that because they are very sensitive to any kind of time and slowness. Keeping the seawall documentation handy because the way that this works is inside of Scout, there's an advanced file entries, and that's where items to your WF client or your region INI file is all managed through. There's a base set on there, just like the normal seawall client, because that's what it's using. So if you need to make changes to where hiding the connection bar or any kind of changes that you want to do through the WF client, you're going to want to manage those through the advanced files, and then you're going to really need that documentation. So keep that handy. I already kind of talked about the dynamic proxy update, and that's just those update repos. Just make sure you're keeping them in sync and have it distributed good. I did bring up the fact about the document scanners in a multi-session. USB redirection is not going to be your friend. You're going to want to make sure that you get SANE enabled. So there's a few pieces to that. You got to be on a VDA that's 2411 or higher. You got to be on 2508 of Seawall. Your Citrix policy, you need to be at CVAD 2411 or higher, or in DAS to have the policy. So there's a number of pieces that all kind of feed in and make sure that the SANE functionality, as well as there's a package for SANE that's on the eLux. And then another issue that we ran into, and this is regarding Imprivata login. So this is the typical healthcare tap and go kind of scenario where you're, expecting a nurse, you're going to come up, nobody's logged in, you tap in, it logs you in, brings your session over, and you start to administer to your patient. Well, we ran into an issue where there was a delay. And so what happens is that the system will come through and it will boot up, and it's not going to have an actual login prompt that it gives you. So the person is unable to badge. We've made Citrix aware of that and working with them on to try to resolve that. Want to go to the documentation?
Yep. Let me go to the next one.
Real quick, there's a question about what was the fix to the login slowness on the upgrade of 2511?
Haven't uncovered that yet. So we're still working through that one.
Okay. Also, 2 minutes.
Yep.
Yep.
So documentation, primarily the key takeaways here is that there's two kind of sources, if you will. There's the UDocs from Unicon, and there's a reference sheet in here later that gives you the link to that. And then there's the Citrix doc. So they're trying to migrate them over. And so you're going to probably have to reference both of those just because not all the information is transferred over. Imprivata, there's a separate implementation guide in the Citrix eDocs that are there. And as the one key piece that we brought to their attention is that server scaling and sizing recommendations and guidance is lacking, and they need to improve that. And then we also had uncovered that their documentation for the iGel to eLux migration was missing some critical steps of information. So we're working with them to try to get that information updated so that way it's more complete.
And I would say they are taking on these updates and recommendations very promptly, so that they are open to read and update as fast as possible.
Yeah.
Also, there might be some, if you're using other thin client operating systems, some of them have partnered for document scanners. The name of the company escapes me right now. Do you remember that name?
You talk of Fabulatech?
Yeah, Fabulatech. So there is no Fabulatech on eLux. So if you are depending on Fabulatech now, our suggestion is that you test truly what you're using Fabulatech for. Maybe you don't need it with the new modern operating systems like ELOX, maybe ELOX is not an opportunity. We have also brought up that to product management, as a lot of people, especially with other operating systems for thin clients, are leveraging Fabiola Tech.
Yeah, and I would just throw out also they stress really if you see problems with their documentation, submit feedback right on the website. Put that back to them. That's how they're tracking it and trying to get that all up there. Just a key point on the Imprivata is although their documentation calls out 26.1, you can use actually 25.2, and you just enable future one. And it's not feature, it's future one. So, and then badge enrollment, which was a critical piece that we learned wasn't available until 2601. So that's in there now. So that was a key piece.
Any quick closing thoughts? Because we have to head over to the closing and prizes.
Nope. I think Imprivata batch enrollment wasn't available until 2601. So if you are really wanted to test this and you have a tap and go, 2601 is the version you want to deploy. Any earlier versions like the 2511 are not available. So look at the 2601.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris and Eduardo. Appreciate your time today and all the insight. If you have any questions, you can find them through the socials or also in the Slack channel as well. Otherwise, everyone, let's head over to the closing and prizes. And so thank you again, Eduardo and Chris.
Thank you.
Appreciate it, guys. Thank you.